The first shot sounded wrong to everyone who heard it. It wasn't the deep, confident crack of a proper anti-tank gun, nor the sharp bark of a service rifle. It was thinner, harsher, almost desperate, like a tool being pushed far beyond what it was ever meant to do. A German panzer rolled forward through drifting snow, its engine rumbling with the calm certainty of steel and fuel, while somewhere ahead of it a Canadian soldier lay flat in the cold, his cheek pressed against frozen earth, steadying a rifle the British themselves had already written off as useless. The distance closed, the tank kept coming, and still the rifle did not move. The boy's anti-tank rifle had a reputation long before it ever reached Canadian hands: too heavy, too slow, too painful to fire. By the time the war was fully underway, it was already being whispered about as a relic, a weapon designed for an earlier version of the battlefield, when tanks were thinner, skinned, and optimism came standard with new equipment. Infantrymen joked that the only real use for the boys was to dig a trench or prop open a door. Officers quietly agreed. Even the men trained to carry it knew the truth. Against modern armor, it was supposed to be hopeless. Canada received the rifle anyway. There was no ceremony when it arrived. No speeches about turning the tide of war. Just crates opened in muddy camps, metal parts lifted into the light, and a shared understanding that this was what they had, and this was what they would use. Canadian units were young, many of the soldiers barely removed from farms, rail yards, and small towns. Some had never fired a shot in anger. Others had never even seen a tank. The boy's rifle, awkward and oversized, felt like an extension of the uncertainty they carried with them. Training was blunt and practical. There were no illusions about stopping a tank head-on. Instructors spoke quietly, pointing at diagrams, tapping weak points with pencils, tracks, vision slits, engine covers. Angles mattered, distance mattered more, patience mattered most of all. The rifle wasn't meant to kill a tank the way artillery did. It was meant to cripple it, blind it, slow it down just enough for something else to finish the job. In Europe, the ground itself became Canada's greatest ally. Narrow roads, hedgerows, villages built long before anyone imagined armored warfare. Tanks could not always maneuver freely. They had to commit. And commitment created moments, brief, fragile moments, where a single man with a heavy rifle could matter. The recoil of the boys was infamous. Firing it felt like being struck by a hammer swung by the rifle itself. Shoulders bruised. Collarbones ached. Some men wrapped cloth around the stock, or wedged anything they could find between steel and bone. But they learned to live with the pain, because pain meant the shot had gone out, and that meant there was still a chance. In the early fighting, Canadian soldiers began to notice something the manuals hadn't emphasized enough. German tank crews were confident, sometimes too confident. They advanced assuming that infantry could do little more than scatter. A tank that believed itself untouchable moved predictably, exposing the same vulnerable areas again and again. That confidence became a flaw. A boy's rifle round wouldn't always penetrate armor, but it didn't need to. A shattered periscope turned a tank blind. A damaged track turned it into a bunker. An engine hit, even a glancing one, filled the crew compartment with smoke and panic. Once stopped, a panzer was no longer a spirit, was a problem waiting to be solved. Stories began to circulate quietly through Canadian units. A tank halted at a crossroads after its track was torn apart. Another reversing suddenly, its crew unsure of what had hit them. Infantry moving in afterward. Grenades and sticky bombs doing what the rifle had started. No one called the boys a miracle weapon. That wasn't the Canadian way, but it was no longer useless. In Italy, where terrain folded in on itself and tanks struggled on narrow mountain roads, the rifle found a strange second life. Canadian soldiers learned to wait above the road, to let armor pass beneath them, to aim not at the thick front plate, but at what the designers had never expected infantry to reach. Gravity helped, so did discipline. One shot, then silence, then movement. The rifle demanded calm, it punished haste. A rushed shot wasted effort and invited retaliation. A patient one could change everything. Men who carried the boys learned to think like hunters rather than soldiers, listening to engines, reading vibrations through the ground, waiting for the exact second when risk and opportunity overlapped. By the time better weapons arrived, bazookas, Piatt-shaped charges, the boy's rifle was already fading from the front line. Officially, it had been replaced. Unofficially, it had earned a quiet respect. It had never been what it was advertised to be, but it had become something else entirely. A weapon that forced ingenuity, restraint, and nerve. Long after the fighting moved on, some Canadian soldiers remembered the weight of it more than the look. The way it dug into the shoulder, the way the world narrowed to breathe and sight, picture, and timing, the way a machine built to dominate the battlefield could be made to hesitate by a single, deliberate shot from a rifle no one believed in. The boys never won the war. It was never supposed to, but in the hands of men who refused to accept that useless meant worthless. It did exactly what Canada needed it to do. It bought seconds. It created openings. It turned confidence into caution. And sometimes in the quiet after the shot, it left a panzer standing still in the snow, no longer advancing, no longer invincible, just another piece of metal waiting for history to move past it. The reputation followed the rifle even as it was pushed deeper into the war. Newer weapons arrived with promises of explosive certainty, and yet the boys remained, leaning against walls, carried on backs, dragged through mud when nothing else was available. It became a weapon of last chances and narrow places, chosen not because it was ideal, but because it was there, and being there mattered more often than anyone liked to admit. Canadian units developed habits around it that were never written down. 2 men usually moved with the rifle, one to fire, one to watch. The watcher learned to read the tank before it arrived, to notice the way infantry escorts spread out, the way an engine note changed when armor climbed or slowed. They learned when to stay still and when to abandon a position before retaliation came crashing back in steel and fire. A single boy's rifle could not stop a column, but it could interrupt it, fracture it, introduce doubt where certainty had lived. There were moments when the rifle felt absurd. A man lying in wet grass, aiming a shoulder, fired weapon at something that weighed 30 tons and carried a gun larger than his entire body. Every instinct said it shouldn't work. And yet the war was full of things that shouldn't have worked but did, simply because someone tried anyway. The Canadians were good at that kind of trying. They had crossed oceans already, left behind familiar land for something colder, louder, and less forgiving. A difficult rifle was just another burden to be managed. The sound of a successful hit was subtle, not an explosion, not even a clear impact. Sometimes it was a sharp metallic crack, followed by a change in the tank's movement. A hesitation, a lurch, a sudden stop that made everyone nearby freeze for a heartbeat. In that pause, everything changed. Infantry surged forward, orders were shouted, smoke thickened, the battlefield bent slightly in a new direction. German crews adapted, of course. They added armor skirts, improved angles, learned to scan more carefully. But adaptation cuts both ways. Canadian soldiers learned to aim lower, to wait longer, to let the tank commit fully before revealing themselves. The boy's rifle forced its user to accept risk fully. There was no quick follow-up shot, no easy escape. Once you fired, you were known. Survival depended on preparation before the trigger was ever pulled. In Normandy, where hedgerows broke the land into tight compartments, the rifle found another unexpected role. Tanks pushing through narrow lanes could not always swing their guns freely. A well-placed shot into a vision slit or suspension component didn't destroy the vehicle, but it disrupted it just enough. Enough for engineers to block the road, enough for artillery to range in, enough for the tank to become an obstacle instead of a threat. Veterans later struggled to explain why the boys mattered at all. On paper, it shouldn't have. It was obsolete before the war even reached its midpoint. But war is not paper. It is timing, terrain, fear, and people making decisions under pressure with whatever they have in their hands. The boy's rifle was a lesson in that reality. It reminded soldiers that usefulness is not fixed. It is negotiated moment by moment under fire. There were nights when the rifle lay unused, its owner listening to engines in the distance, knowing that daylight would bring movement. There were days when it was fired once and then abandoned, its job done, and there were times when it never left the shoulder at all, carried simply because the possibility mattered, because even a small chance was better than none. As Canada's forces matured, so did their confidence. They no longer waited for perfect equipment or ideal conditions. They worked with what they had, improved it, adapted it, and moved forward. The boy's rifle fit that mindset perfectly. Awkward, underestimated, and stubbornly present. When the war finally ended, the rifle disappeared quietly. It was not paraded. It did not become a symbol. It was placed in depots, museums, memories. But among those who had lain behind it, feeling the cold seep into their bones while steel rolled closer, it held a different meaning. It was proof that dismissal could be wrong, that labels like useless often say more about expectations than reality. Long after the sound of engines faded, what remained was the understanding that sometimes victory does not come from the best tool, but from the refusal to accept that a tool has no value at all. And in that refusal, in the calm breath before the shot, in the steady aim against impossible odds, the boy's rifle became something no one had planned for. It became enough. After the battles were over and the fields fell quiet, the rifle lingered in conversation more than in photographs. It appeared in the margins of recollections, mentioned briefly and then set aside, as if speaking of it too directly gave it more importance than it was ever meant to have. Canadian soldiers were like that. They didn't romanticize hardship. They acknowledged it, carried it, and then moved on. The boy's rifle fit neatly into that way of remembering. Impressive at first glance, uncomfortable to recall in detail, but impossible to erase entirely. What the rifle really did, more than anything else, was change how men saw themselves in the presence of armor. Tanks were meant to dominate. Their very existence on the battlefield was psychological, designed to shrink infantry into cover before a single shot was fired. The boys challenged that idea, quietly and without ceremony. It told the man behind it that he was not entirely helpless, that even against steel there was a way to act instead of simply endure. That sense mattered more than penetration statistics or official reports. A soldier who believes he can do something behaves differently from one who believes he can do nothing. Canadian infantry learned this early, and the rifle became part of that education. It wasn't about heroics. It was about balance, finding the thin line between caution and paralysis, between bravery and recklessness. In some units, the boy's rifle became a kind of shared responsibility. No one wanted to carry it for long, but everyone understood why someone had to. The man assigned to it was treated differently, not with admiration, but with a quiet respect. He was the one expected to wait longer, to expose himself last, to make a decision that could not be undone. When he moved into position, others instinctively adjusted around him, aware that whatever happened next would begin with a single shot and unfold very quickly afterward. There were failures, too, shots that bounced uselessly, rifles that jammed under stress, positions discovered before the trigger could be pulled. These moments didn't make it into celebratory accounts, but they lived just as strongly in memory. They reinforced the truth that the rifle was never a guarantee, only an option. And in war, options are everything. As months passed, Canadian soldiers grew more experienced, and experience has a way of stripping illusion from everything it touches. The boy's rifle stopped being judged by what it was supposed to do and started being measured by what it actually did. It delayed, it distracted, it damaged. Sometimes it frightened crews who had never considered that a lone infantryman might challenge them at all. Those effects were subtle, but they accumulated, shaping behavior in ways no report could fully capture. In villages liberated and then abandoned again, the rifle was sometimes left behind intentionally, propped in a doorway or hidden in rubble, its presence a message as much as a weapon. It said that resistance could appear from unexpected places, that movement carried risk, that the battlefield was never entirely under control. Even when unfired, it served a purpose. Canadian adaptability became a quiet theme of the war, often overshadowed by louder narratives. They were not known for revolutionary weapons or dramatic last stands, but for steady pressure and practical solutions. The boy's rifle was exactly that kind of solution, imperfect, uncomfortable, but workable. It embodied a refusal to wait for ideal circumstances before acting. Years later, when historians tried to categorize weapons into neat timelines of progress and obsolescence, the rifle didn't fit cleanly. It arrived too early and stayed too long. It was surpassed but not erased. It occupied a strange middle ground where usefulness depended entirely on the person holding it and the moment they chose to use it. That ambiguity made it easy to dismiss and hard to fully understand. For the men who fired it, understanding came through sensation rather than analysis, the smell of burnt powder, the echo of the shot in confined terrain, the immediate awareness that hiding was no longer an option, the scramble to relocate while ears rang and breath came hard. These experiences did not feel like history while they were happening. They felt like survival. As the war ended and life moved on, many of those men never spoke of the rifle again, not because it was insignificant, but because it represented a kind of quiet endurance that didn't lend itself to storytelling. It was a reminder of a time when success depended less on superiority and more on persistence, awareness, and restraint. In the end, the boy's rifle did not change the direction of the war by itself. It did something smaller and, in its own way, more human. It changed how a group of soldiers faced fear. It taught them that even flawed tools could be shaped into something effective through patience and thought. It turned dismissal into opportunity and opportunity into action, one careful shot at a time. And long after the last panzer was silenced and the snow melted from forgotten fields, that lesson remained, carried forward not in steel or wood, but in the quiet confidence of those who had once looked at something labeled useless, and decided it was worth trying anyway.